This is It's a Mystery Podcast. Let us tell you a story. Hello, mystery readers, and welcome to episode 72 of It's a Mystery Podcast. I'm your host, Alexandra Amor, and today I've got a great interview for you with Peter Bartram. Peter is from the UK. He sets his books called the Crampton Chronicles Mysteries in Brighton in the 1960s. Peter was a guest on episode 27 of the show, and we dove into a few of the reasons that he chose to write in that decade. For one thing, he said it was a fun decade to write about, the swinging 60s. And then the other thing he said was that it was his era. You know, he was a newspaperman at that time, and he was familiar with what newspaper offices looked like then. And his character, Colin Crampton, works as a newspaperman. So that's when he decided to set these novels. So they're a little bit historical, not back in the 18th century or anything, but it's a really interesting era for Peter to be writing about. So we've got a lovely interview for you with him today. He's reading from another one of his mysteries called The Tango School Mystery, and I think you're really going to enjoy that. And then one thing I wanted to mention this week is I was reminded about libraries and ordering books from libraries. Now, we all have our different ways of reading. I, for one, I either tend to borrow ebooks from the British Columbia library system, or and I guess I should say, I read an ebook now 98% of the time, I would say. The only time I read a physical book anymore is when it's not available in ebook form. So I either borrow it from the library or I buy books. And I have that really, I used to always, of course, read in paperback. And then I got an iPad mini, I don't know, 5 or 6, it might be more years ago than that. So I have all the reading apps on my mini. So the Kindle app, the Kobo app, the library app, which is called Overdrive. That's the one I use. And that's how I read. And I just wanted to remind you, or let you know, if you didn't know already, that most of my guests' books are available through the library systems. So you don't necessarily have to purchase books from the authors that I'm interviewing. And the thing to remember, too, is that if you hear an author on the show who's of particular interest to you and you'd like to try their books out, there's 2 different ways to go about that. Most authors that I interview have something available, a taste of one of their books available for free at their website. And I always try to point to that so that you can know that you can go and try out their books. But then the other thing is that you can, if the book isn't available in your local library, you can ask for it. You know, libraries are always looking for ways to serve their patrons because libraries are supported by the people who read the books there. So if you just go to your local librarian and mention the author's name, and you can even say that you prefer to read an audiobook or ebook or whatever it is, and you know, it's more than likely that they'll try to get that book in for you because they're really trying, as I said, to serve their people, and you are their people. Now, of course, they have budgets. It's not always 100% possible, but I wanted to mention that just so that you knew that it isn't necessary to purchase all the books that you're interested in, even if they're by independent authors. And those are the people that I'm trying to interview. Probably, I would say 90% of the interviews on It's a Mystery are with independent authors who are writing and publishing their own books. But even so, those books are going to be available through libraries. So just wanted to mention that. And then speaking of patrons, I've added a new option at It's a Mystery, and that is for you to support the show if you wanted to. So I started a Patreon account. And if you haven't heard of Patreon, it's a way for people to support those artistic and other endeavors in an ongoing basis that they appreciate and the things that they like. So I support several people on Patreon. Some are artists. One is a farm where if a lady in the United States rescues animals. So she's got a big farm, I can't even remember what state it's in, called Little Buckets Farm Sanctuary. So it's those kinds of things. And it's sort of, I like it because it helps me to feel like I'm contributing, but it's in a way that's extremely affordable. So in my case, if you go to patreon.com/it's a mystery, for less than a cup of fluffy coffee, you can help to sort of co-create the show. You can be a contributor, a patron, and your patronage pays for some of my time producing the show and also contributes to the hosting costs. And the show here will always be free, and I'd like to keep advertising off the show. So I thought this was one way that I might be able to go ahead and do that, and just, have the audience contribute to what's being created here. So if you have any other questions or anything, you can always reach out to me. It's a mysterypodcast.com, and my email address is info@alexandraamor.com. And for now, I'll leave you there, and please enjoy this interview with Peter Bartram, and I'll see you next week. Welcome, everyone. I'm Alexandra Amor. This is It's a Mystery Podcast, and I'm here today with Peter Bartram. Hi, Peter.
Hi, Alexandra. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
Excellent form, thank you.
Good. Well, let me introduce you to all of our listeners. Peter Bartram brings years of experience as a journalist to his Crampton of the Chronicle crime mysteries. He has done most things in journalism, from doorstepping for quotes to writing serious editorials. He's covered stories in locations as different as 700 feet down a coal mine and Buckingham Palace. Peter launched his Crampton series in 2015 with Headline Murder. As of now, there are 12 books in the series with well over 120,000 readers around the world. It's lovely to talk to you again, Peter. You were here on episode 27, and you've been busy since then.
Well, it's great to be back, and yes, I have been busy. There are now 12 books in the Crampton series, and the 13th will come out in the summer. Oh. It's going to be called The Beach Party Mystery.
Perfect. That's amazing. Well, I'm so happy for you. All right, Peter, why don't you tell us a little bit about the portion of this book that you're going to read?
Okay, well, I'm going to read you something from the Tango School Mystery, and we take up the story where crime reporter Colin Crampton and his girlfriend Shirley Goldsmith are having dinner in a restaurant called Antoine's Sussex Grill. They suddenly find that there's more blood on Shirley's rare steak than they'd expected. And they look up and they find that blood is dripping through the ceiling from above. Well, there's an apartment upstairs above the restaurant, and Colin knows what he's got to do next. So let's take up the story from there.
Great.
And it's Colin telling you the story. He narrates the book.
Okay.
In Antoine's Sussex Grill, Shirley slammed down her knife and fork. She'd lost interest in her steak. The blood-stained remnants lay on her plate. Another droplet of blood formed on the ceiling. It shone like a ruby. I glanced up at it and sighed in a resigned sort of way. I knew I wasn't going to enjoy what I had to do next. I'm going upstairs, I said. How? Shirley asked. There's a separate front door to the apartment in the street. I'm coming with you. No. It's best you wait here. If we both rush out, Antoine will think we're doing a runner to avoid paying the bill. Shirley grinned. It'll be great exercise, Cobber. Not now. There are more important things to deal with. I crossed the room and stepped into the street. Across the road, a couple of drunks lurched out of the Smugglers. A young woman with blonde hair in a beehive, tight skirt and killer stilettos staggered by. A taxi cruised down the street looking for a fare. The driver eyed me briefly, then focused on the blonde. I stared up at the first-floor apartment window. The light was on, and the curtains, tired brown numbers that hung like a beggar's rags, were half-drawn. They let out a shard of light. The front door to the apartment was at the end of the building. It was recessed into the wall in a kind of porch arrangement. I stepped into the porch and rapped firmly on the door, twice. On the second rap, the door moved. It hadn't been shut properly. I pushed gently and it swung open. Its hinges creaked like a pensioner's kneecaps. I stepped into a small hallway which led to a flight of stairs. The place was lit by a dusty bulb hanging from a short flex cable. The walls were covered with embossed wallpaper painted a muddy cream. A picture of a yacht sailing in a stormy sea had slipped sideways in its frame. An umbrella was propped in the corner. There was a threadbare grey carpet on the stairs. The place had a fusty smell that comes from wet clothes drying in front of gas fires. I moved to the foot of the stairs, wondering whether this had been a good idea. I shouted up, "Hello, is anyone at home? I've just come round to see if you're all right." Somewhere in the house, something creaked. But that would be the result of the cooler air flooding in after I'd opened the front door. Natural in an old building like this. At least, that's what I told myself. I shouted again, "Nothing to worry about. I'll just come up to make sure you're all right." I listened. Something else creaked. Softly, but twice. I shouted, "I'll come up now unless you say not to." Nobody shouted, "Clear off and leave me alone." But then a dead body wouldn't, nor would an intruder, especially one whose soft shoe shuffle made the old floorboards creak twice. I looked over my shoulder at the door, wondered whether I should leave quietly and shut it behind me, call the cops, let them take the glory, or a bullet in the forehead. The safety first option. But safety first leaves you standing on the outside, forever wondering what it must be like to be the guy who gets the action, never the guy who wins the medals, or in my case, lands the front page story. Safety first leaves you growing old, wondering what life could have been like. Besides, what would I tell Shirley if I scurried back with nothing to show for my original bravado? And anyway, I knew I had to find out who was upstairs, or what was upstairs. I slunk up the stairs with all the enthusiasm of a Tommy growing over the top at the Battle of the Somme. The stairs led into a landing with 3 doors. 2 of them, one in front of me and one to the left, were closed. The door to the right was open. A light was on inside. I stood in the landing and listened for a sound, any sound, like a moan, or a whispered plea for help, or a rasp of breath from an intruder. But I only heard silence. And then a creak. Not once or twice this time, 3 times. And it came from behind the closed door to the left. I stepped silently over and put my ear to the door like a nosy Parker listening in on the neighbours. The floorboards creaked again, but softly, as though they didn't mean to. I took hold of the doorknob and turned it. I pushed the door gently. Nobody pushed back, so I flung open the door and stood back. A tabby cat shot out of the room with a piercing screech. It raced across the landing and stopped at the entrance to the lighted room. It turned round and stared at me, bared its teeth and snarled, the moggy equivalent of "Don't try anything if you know what's good for you." I bared my teeth back, but its eyes radiated withering contempt. Besides, I was in no mood for staring competition with the cat. I stepped into the darkened room where the little beast had been imprisoned and switched on the light. It was a bedroom. There was an iron bedstead with tangled bedclothes. There was a dressing table with a hairbrush, a couple of combs, and a half-used jar of Brill cream. Across the room, the door of a wardrobe hung half open. I walked over and looked inside. The wardrobe held a couple of shabby jackets, a pair of grey flannel trousers, 3 shirts with crumpled collars, and a cardigan with frayed sleeves. Evidently, Beau Brummel didn't live here. There was a bedside table. A glass of water, a bottle of pills, and a book rested on it. I moved across the room and looked at the book. It was called Hitler's Permanent Wave. How the Fuhrer escaped Berlin and began a new life as a ladies' hairdresser in South America. Its 300 pages of nonsense had been penned by somebody called Titus Scrivener. I flipped over the cover to see whether the inside flap held any further information on Scrivener. Instead, I found an inscription on the title page. Denny Clapham. Time for the truth. Best wishes, Titus. So presumably this was Clapham's apartment. But I'd forgotten why I was flipping through Clapham's bedtime reading. Downstairs in the restaurant there had been blood on the ceiling. Up here, in the apartment, there should be a corresponding pool of blood on the floor. I'd been too diverted by a creaking floorboard and a cat to focus on the main purpose of my mission. If the blood had been leaking onto our table below, which room of the apartment would it be in? I glanced out of the window into the street to help me get my bearings. The Smugglers was slightly to my left. When Shirley and I were sitting in the restaurant, we'd been exactly opposite the pub. So that must mean the blood was in the lighted room, the room that had been to my right when I'd come up the stairs. I hurried out of the bedroom, thoughtfully turning off the light after me. I crossed the landing and entered what was obviously a sitting room. In the middle of the room there was an ancient settee upholstered in brown leather. The leather had long ago faded and started to crack. A small Indian rug covered the bare floorboards in front of the settee. There was an easy chair piled high with an eclectic collection of old newspapers and magazines. I spotted the Daily Telegraph, the New York Herald Tribune, the European edition, the Spectator, the New Daily, Paris Match and La Stampa. On the far wall, a glass cabinet held a half-empty bottle of scotch and a few glasses. I resisted the temptation to help myself. To my left, another door was ajar. By the half-light from the sitting room, I could see a sink piled with dirty crops and the edge of a cooker. My brilliant deductive powers were on top of that straight away. But the kitchen was at the back of the building, and Shirley and I had been sitting at the front, so any blood must be in the sitting room where I was standing. I looked around the room, couldn't see any blood on the floor. Then the cat stepped out from behind the settee. It looked a lot less cocky than when we'd eyeballed one another on the landing. It slunk across the room, leaving a trail of red paw prints on bare boards. I took a deep breath and crossed the room. I looked behind the settee, knowing I wasn't going to like what I would find. A man's body was lying there. He was middle-aged, had thinning brown hair, and was dressed in a pair of blue slacks and a grey pullover. His throat had been cut so deeply I could see neck bone showing. It was as though his neck had opened in a scream. Death must have been quick, but not instant, because a pool of blood had flowed from his wound. The floor wasn't level, common in older buildings in central Brighton, and blood had drained into a crack between the floorboards. That would have been how it formed the stain on the ceiling below. My heart pounded like a steam hammer. A troop of acrobats started turning somersaults in my stomach. I reached for the edge of the settee to steady myself, closed my eyes and took a couple of deep breaths. Felt a little better. Knew that my next step must be to call the cops. Then a crash, like a dozen tin cans rattling in a bin, shattered the silence in the kitchen. Something metal and heavy landed on the floor, making a racket like scrap metal falling off the back of a lorry, and then glass smashed like a window had just been punched out. I swerved around the edge of the settee and dashed towards the kitchen. But the moggy had been scared witless by the racket. It fled across the room in front of me. I tripped over the animal and took off like the first man trying to fly without wings. I landed full on my front, like I'd been dumped without a chute 20,000 feet from an airplane. I crashed onto the floor and felt the wind rush out of me. The moggy hissed and disappeared under the drift of newspapers in the easy chair. I lay there feeling more foolish than injured while I gasped from air to reinflate my lungs. Then I pushed myself onto my hands and knees. I stood up and made my way gingerly towards the kitchen, keeping an eye out for stray cats. The floor of the kitchen was littered with half a dozen pots and pans. They'd been pushed hastily from a draining board. window behind the draining wall was smashed, so all the glass had gone. Outside the window, there was a metal fire escape leading down to an alleyway which ran between the buildings. I climbed onto the board, avoided shards of broken glass, and peered out of the window. There was no one on the fire escape. The alley wasn't lit, but towards the far end, I could make out the shape of a man. He was moving at the determined pace of someone who knew that his night's work was done and that he was going to get away.
Ah, lovely. Thank you so much, Peter. That was fantastic.
Thank you very much.
So, Peter, you, when we last spoke, I think you had maybe 3 books in the Crampton Chronicles series at that point. And as we mentioned up top, you've got 12 now. So what's it been like writing a character for the last 3 or 4 years and getting to know him a little better?
Well, it's been a very interesting thing to do because he's developed a lot over the years, and Shirley, his girlfriend, has developed even more in a way than he has. Right at the beginning, Shirley was more of a background character. She was Colin's foil, but she now takes a much more active role in the stories, and indeed often rescues Colin when he gets into a situation which is a bit difficult for him. So it's been interesting to see how these characters have developed through the books, and as they've faced up to ever more challenging and sometimes dangerous situations.
And was Shirley's development something that you had planned, or did that just happen?
I think it just happened. In the very first book, which is Headline Murder, Colin has just met Shirley, and their relationship is very much one of on and off. Colin is a great scamster as a journalist. He's always pulling scams in order to get his stories. And in Headline Murder, Shirley always seemed to be the butt of them. Things went wrong, and she always ended up with the troubled end of it. And at the end of the book, he decides to go off to India, leaving Colin, and in fact, that's what she does. But, well, I'll have to give you a little bit of a spoiler here, I'm afraid. But she comes back in book 2, and they get together again. And because she's been away, it's as though their relationship becomes different. It becomes much more a relationship of equals than a kind of master and mistress relationship. And of course, Colin meets Shirley because she's an Australian, and she's doing what a lot of Australians did in those days. They took a year out to tour the world, and she happened to pitch up in Brighton for a time, and she was working as a waitress in order to make enough money to do the next leg of her journey. But she never got to do that, of course. But when we meet her in later books, she's a very lovely girl. She's become a model, so she's in the world of modelling, and that's kind of changing her relationship. It's changing her attitude. It's making her much more confident and sassy. And so Colin and Shirley become much more equal than they were in earlier books.
Oh, well, I love hearing that. That's fantastic.
And I can tell you, there's another development for Shirley coming up in the Beach Party mystery, which comes out in the summer.
Okay, exciting. And one thing I noticed was that you've grouped the books in 3 different series. And what was the reasoning behind that? They're all Colin and Sheila, essentially.
Shirley,
sorry. She's Shirley the Sheila, so I get it mixed up.
Yeah, Shirley is Shirley the Sheila. That's right, yeah. Yes, well, the reason for that is the first 3 books in the series, that's Headline Murder, Stop Press Murder, and Front Page Murder, were all published by Roundfire, a publishing company. They wanted to carry on with the series, but I felt there would be more opportunity in publishing them personally, individually, self-publishing them. In fact, that has actually proved to be the case. So they're divided into 2 series. So there's the Crampton and the Chronicle mysteries, which are the Headline Murder, Stop Press Murder, Front Page Murder, and then there's the Deadline murder series, which starts with the Tango School mystery, the Mother's Day mystery, the Comedy Club mystery, the Poker Game mystery, and then in the summer, the Beach Party mystery. On top of that, we've got a trilogy called the Morning, Noon and Night trilogy, which consists of Murder in the Morning edition, Murder in the Afternoon extra, Murder in the Night final. And we've got a book of short stories, which incidentally is free on Amazon. That's called Murder from the News Desk. And if you sign up to my website and database, you get a free book there called Murder in Capital Letters.
Mm. Oh, I see. Okay, got it.
So it's all growing into quite a complicated tree structure.
A little empire you've got going there. That's awesome. But what I love is that there's the consistency of the characters throughout all the books.
Oh, yes, yeah. Indeed, yeah.
Have you had...
Sorry, I was going to say, it's already been my intention to run the books through the 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
And so they started in 1962, and we're up to about 1966 now.
Mm.
So we'll reach 1969. Well, that may be the end, or it may not. We'll have to wait and see.
Okay, yeah, that was my question, if you'd ever had an urge to write any other kind of character.
I have experimented with a couple of other books. Neither of them I thought were very successful. One was a crime mystery set in Edwardian times with a female protagonist.
Mm-hmm.
I think it had some merit, but I wasn't happy with it. And then I tried something completely different, which was a more what they call high concept thriller, based around the idea of climate change and global warming. And that didn't really work because it's supposed to be a very serious subject, and I kept putting jokes in. Well, that's fine for Crampton of the Chronicle, but not for a serious subject like that.
Right.
So I've decided to stick with what I can do best, which is the comic crime mystery.
Well, and I can completely understand that because I find myself as a writer that certain characters fit our natural voice. And at times, if we try to go outside of that and fit ourselves into a different kind of box, it doesn't really work. So I completely understand.
Yes, I entirely agree with you about the question of voice.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you're not a writer and a writer starts wittering on about, I've got to find my voice, you think they're just talking a lot of nonsense, but it's absolutely true.
Mm-hmm.
If you can catch the voice of your protagonist, then you're not going to get very far. And that's particularly important when you're writing in the first person rather than the third person, because you've got to catch every intonation of their speech, their thought process, and everything else in what you're writing.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I absolutely agree. And when I interviewed you before, which was in July of 2016, I looked back and realized it's been a while. We talked about your past as a journalist. And so do you find that your ideas for the new books are still coming from that experience, or where do they come from?
Well, they come from all kinds of sources. The Tango School mystery, funnily enough, did come from my experience as a journalist. It came from a public meeting I had to report on. This was way back in, I think, 1966. And it was rather an odd meeting, but I won't go into details, but it gave me the idea for the Tango School mystery. The Mother's Day mystery, which was the next one along in that particular series, I got the idea from my old school. I went to a school which was founded back in 1614 and housed in the original buildings, great sort of old, gloomy Jacobean buildings with heavy oak beams and leaded windows. And it was all kind of ghostly and spooky, and that gave me the idea for the Mother's Day mystery. The Comedy Club mystery, some people may have heard of a comedian who was very famous in the UK in the 1940s and 1950s called Max Miller. At one time, he was the highest paid entertainer in the UK. And he came from Brighton, where all the books are set. And there's a statue of him in the Pavilion Gardens in Brighton. And I was walking past that statue one day and looked at it, and that gave me the idea for the Comedy Club mystery. And then the poker game mystery. I read about a secret wartime group of men who were based in and around Brighton, and that gave me the idea for the poker game mystery. And then we had pirate radio stations, which were in the 1960s, which broadcast from ships outside the 3-mile limit. And that's given me the idea for the beach party mystery. So these ideas, they come from all kinds of sources. But of course, the thing about an idea, and this is, I think, what sorts out people who end up writing a book from people who have an idea but don't end up writing a book, is developing that idea into a plot and then writing 75,000 words about it.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. No, it's quite a different thing, isn't it? Yeah, to have the original inspiration and then turn it into something that's entertaining and that has twists and turns and surprises along the way.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, what was my next question? I guess we're all just about out of time, but what I wanted to ask too was what your writing routine is like. You've been so prolific since I last talked to you. Do you write every day? Do you write at a specific time of day, that kind of thing?
Well, of course, spent my life working as a journalist, and I still regard myself as a journalist, really, although I'm not doing much journalism now. I'm doing a lot of book writing. That's why they're coming out at the rate of 2 a year at the moment. Mm-hmm. But yes, I'm in my office pretty much by 9 o'clock every morning, and I'm there or round about it until about 5 or 6 in the evening. Working away, not always on books. I have other work to do as well, and sometimes I'm doing that. But yes, I've got a pretty regular work routine, and I think you have to have one if you're going to produce a lot of publishable written work. And that discipline, in my case, came from working as a journalist, latterly as a freelance journalist for over 40 years. Mm-hmm. Writing for newspapers and magazines.
Right. So, yeah, that muscle of just showing up at the desk has long been developed in you. That's great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this has been amazing, Peter. Thank you so much for chatting with me and sharing a bit of your book with us. I really appreciate it. Why don't you let everybody know where they can find out more about you and your work?
Well, you can go to the website www.collincrampton.com, so that's collincrampton.com, or just Google me on Amazon and you'll find all the books there. And for the audio books, go to Audible. They're all on there.
Fantastic. Well, that's great. Thank you so much. And I'll put links in the show notes to all of that so people can easily find. And you mentioned too that if they go to collincrampton.com, they can get a free book. Is that right?
If they sign up to the newsletter, we have a newsletter that goes out once or twice a month. Yeah. Little articles, background articles, and so forth. Yep, they get a free book called Murder in Capital Letters.
Perfect. Well, that's awesome. Well, thank you again so much, Peter, for being here today.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. It's been great fun.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you for listening. You can always find episode show notes and links to the books mentioned on the show at itsamysterypodcast.com. While you're there, you can also grab your copies of 2 free mystery novellas by me, Alexandra Amor. Until next time, happy reading!